Hey friends, Eric Nevins here. We're going to get the show started in just a moment, but first, I wanted to just put out the call again because I've had the chance to talk to several of you about what you like about the show. This week, I got to talk to Sean. Sean, thanks so much for reaching out and chatting with me. I can't wait to hang out with you a lot more. But also, we had a great conversation, and Sean was able to share with me what he likes about the show and what he wants to hear more of. That means a lot to me, and it really is helpful. So I want to put this call out again. If you've heard this show, you've heard this conversation and me ask you to reach out before, and you haven't done anything, today's your day, okay? Just do it right now. Just go to halfwaytherepodcast.com/contact, halfwaytherepodcast.com/contact, and just send me an email. Let me know that you want to hear, that you want to talk to me, and I will set up a call with you. We'll do, could be 15 minutes, could be half an hour, whatever works in your schedule. I'm happy to spend time. I want to hear from you. I want to know. Anyway, I've got a conversation that I want to have. So if you want to do that, I would love to hear from you. Again, it's really super easy. halfwaytherepodcast.com/contact. Thanks again, Sean. It was great to connect with you. We'll see you later. Hey, let's do the show. All right. Well, welcome to Halfway There, my friends. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I'm your host, Eric Nevins. Thank you so much for being here and listening to this. I really think you're going to enjoy this conversation. I've been following our guest today on Twitter for a long time and got a chance to just connect with him. He is the founder and director of Alongsiders International. He's also an author, including several books, but I want to highlight Urban Halo and a book that I've been reading recently, Subversive Jesus, An Adventure in Justice, Mercy, and Faithfulness in a Broken World. My guest is Craig Greenfield. Craig, welcome to Halfway There.
Hey, great to be with you, Eric.
Yeah, I'm so glad to make the connection, and it's always fun. I've been really seeking out people like yourself, so I think I mentioned to you before that are not kind of in my immediate context. And so I really appreciate you kind of, just making the connection with me and sharing your story with me.
No problem. Yeah, I'm over here in Cambodia, so I'm out of most people's context, but
Absolutely.
it's good to be connected all around the world.
It is. It's the power of the internet, right? It's a tool that we get to use for good. So that'll be fun. Cambodia. So that is, I know that it's an interesting story, and we're gonna talk about that. But tell us a little bit about what you do now.
Sure. Well, I lead a movement called Alongsiders. It's a discipleship movement. Basically, it's in the non-Western world. So we challenge young Christians across Asia and Africa to walk alongside one child each in their own community, kind of like a little brother or a little sister, and disciple them, encourage them, love them. And it's a simple but powerful commitment. And we're seeing there's about more than 5,000 involved in the movement now worldwide in 16 countries. And so we're seeing something significant happening amongst this generation. Particularly in the non-Western world. So it's exciting. It's exciting to see what God is doing.
Yeah. What do they do as like a big brother? What is that role like, and what are the results that you've been seeing?
Yeah, so we call them alongsiders rather than big brothers, but basically they choose someone who's their neighbor. It could be a child who's orphaned or struggling in some way. And a lot of these kids, a lot of these alongsiders themselves are very poor. They may, I've visited them in mud huts in parts of Africa or in slum shacks across here in Asia. And so they're poor themselves, but they're a few steps ahead of their little brother and sister. So they go and visit them. We've developed a whole comic book curriculum. We use mobile phone apps and animations and all that kind of stuff to really connect in ways that engage children and youth these days.
Yeah.
And just really build a relationship. I believe that it's relationships that, God uses relationships to transform lives, and that discipleship, if we want people to know how to follow Jesus in everyday life, we need to disciple them in everyday life, not just in a classroom once a week.
Right. Yeah, there's a way that the way of Jesus is about what we do every day rather than what we know.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Not to say that what we know is unimportant. That's very valuable as well. But yeah. Well, so I want to just hear more of your story and hear about how you came to this place. And so tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up. So you grew up in New Zealand.
Yeah, grew up in New Zealand, pretty affluent background, kind of majority white neighborhood. But my parents lived lives of what I would now call radical hospitality. So they had a big house, but they filled it up with people who had come in refugee situations, foster kids, people out of prison. And so I grew up kind of bridged between these two worlds, kind of an affluent white upbringing, but my parents just welcoming people from the margins into our home and into our lives. And that for me was the fleshing out of what it means to follow Jesus. And so when I made my own decision to follow Jesus later on, it was natural that I would kind of seek out those ways of following Jesus and discovering Jesus amongst the poor and exploring what he meant when he said, "Blessed are the poor, and I've come to bring good news to the poor."
Yeah.
And so that's been a huge part of my journey and what brought me to Cambodia and to live in the slums in Cambodia.
So why did they do that? Like what? So what? Like I guess I mean, obviously we could say okay, they because they were Jesus followers, but why? Like why in the world would they? Why did that occur to them? What was in their background that made them think we've got to do this?
Good question. I've actually have never really grappled with that. I know my mum grew up real poor herself, and she knew what it was like to be lacking in material possessions. Her family was dysfunctional in some ways, and so. Yeah, I guess she was living out something that she had experienced God's love and was passing that on to others. And then my father grew up in India, and his parents were missionaries in India. So there's background stuff there that I guess we could trace. And it's often when we get out of our comfort zone, when our eyes see the rest of the world or experience something that our hearts are impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting. I want to take a trip with our kids sometime soon because just because of that. Like we need to get outside of suburban Denver,
I kind of feel like what the eye has not seen, the heart cannot grieve, because there's so much, there's so much information out there, but until we kind of experience it face to face, it's hard to truly make it. Part of our story, part of what God's doing in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you have this really amazing example of parents who, even though they were affluent, they wanted to use that to help people. And so when you mentioned that when you decided to follow Jesus, it was natural to go that way also. How did you decide, how did that happen for you that you were going to follow Jesus?
I guess you might be surprised to know that I didn't immediately want to follow Jesus. Even growing up like that, I felt like, wow, the stakes are high on this. There's no half measures, and I wasn't sure I was fully in. So actually, it wasn't until 21 before I kind of turned towards Jesus. And at that point, it took a pretty radical grabbing of my neck from God to really turn me around, because I kind of felt, to follow Jesus is not something we do half-heartedly. It's not something we give him 10% of our time and money and we're sweet. Right. It's something that takes our whole life.
Yeah. Well, do you want to share that story? Like what happened? What was, it sounds dramatic.
Okay. I don't share the story much, but I actually had a kind of a spiritual warfare encounter, and someone was praying for me, and I experienced what I would characterize as some spiritual warfare. And it took many hours. Other people had to come in and be a part of praying. And I was that night, there was just absolutely no question whatsoever in my mind that the spiritual realm is real, that there's a battle going on. And I'm not super charismatic or anything, but that was certainly my entrance into the faith.
Oh, interesting. And so
Yeah.
you because you had that experience with apparently some nefarious forces, I guess I'll say, you decided I'm going to follow Jesus.
Yeah. And I mean, I wonder if that kind of on ramp into the faith was significant, just in the sense of, now that I work in Asia and Africa, that's very real for people here. In the Western world, it's peripheral, unless you're in the charismatic church. But here in Asia and Africa, that's just a given. It's just a part of everyday life. And I could tell you interesting stories around how that kind of thing plays out here.
Yeah, so fascinating. That's interesting. If that maybe was like you kind of needed to have that experience, knowing that God knowing that later on that would be something that you would deal with, and had to have a kind of a openness to
God takes everything, and he mixes it up.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay. I'm curious about your early learning experiences, because I'm guessing that you were already steeped in the church, even if you hadn't gotten your life to Christ, if your parents were believers. So how did you begin to learn after you became a believer on your own? How did you learn? How did God kind of teach you about him?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of course, what I've described so far has been kind of experiential and almost emotional, but I'm a head person. And God has certainly taught me through books and through teachers, and those kind of things have been a big part of my journey. Reading often outside of kind of the mainstream stuff, because my experiences of being amongst the poor were not addressed by most Christian authors. And that's one of the reasons why I've chosen to write a bit, even though doesn't necessarily come naturally to me. I don't love blogging, but I just find no one's writing about this stuff. And there's a majority of the church, majority of the world is living it. We need a theology that speaks to us about it. But part of my experience was going to Cambodia. I was at university. I got to know some young folks in the slums, and there was one particular guy. I had practiced my Cambodian language and tried really hard to come up with a gospel presentation in Cambodian, and I shared it with him one day when we were out, and he looked at me with his big eyes, kind of watery, and just looked me in the face, and he said, "Craig, this is not for me. I'm very poor. I'm very poor."
Oh wow!
And my response was, "Well, no, you're not getting it. This is for rich and for poor. It's for Asian and Western. It's for everybody. It's just good news. It's generic." And he said, "No, Craig, I am very poor." And that struck me. I went home and I had a sleepless night, and from that point on, I just began grappling with Jesus went out of his way to say he'd come to bring good news to the poor.
Right.
And yet somehow what I was communicating did not sound like good news to him, did not sound like something that was for him. And so in many ways, I've spent the next 20 years of my life, the last 20 years of my life since that day, figuring out what does it mean to bring good news to the poor.
Oh, wow. That's so amazing. What's interesting about it is it's the exact opposite of the rich young ruler, right? The guy who was just rich and was like, no, I can't give it all away.
Yeah. Well, the good news sounded like bad news to him.
Right. No joke.
And if you look at the Magnificat, or Mary's song from Luke, Yeah, so one way of putting it is the good news is good news to the poor, and for those of us who are in power and with wealth, there's some hard stuff in there.
Can you just give us a little bit about why the Magnificat speaks to us there?
Yeah, well, I love the Magnificat because, well, it's the longest recorded words of a woman in the Bible, and it's interesting how it's been banned from being spoken and read in all kinds of countries around the world under the British imperial rule of India. It was banned.
Wow.
And when the British rule came to an end, Gandhi said, "We're gonna have this read all over India." And so throughout history, it's kind of been one of these subversive texts that we skip over, especially us Westerners. We skip over these words that say the rich will be sent away hungry and the poor will be fed. The powerful will be torn down from their thrones and the lowly will be lifted up. And one of the ways that we deal with radical subversive passages like this in the Gospels is to hyper-spiritualize them. Instead of recognizing that there are economic aspects of the gospel, there are political aspects of the gospel. Jesus wants to transform every part of our life. And in fact, I would say that if you look through the Gospels, when we see where it said Jesus preached the good news, it says almost in every instant, it says the good news of the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is so much more than a ticket to heaven after we die, which is what I was offering my poor friend in the slum.
Yeah,
that's what I was offering him. Hey, free ticket to heaven after you die. And he was saying, well, actually, right here and now, I am poor. I am struggling. And what I missed at that time was that the kingdom of God is something that Jesus asks us to call to come here on earth as it is in heaven. And that there are very real earthly implications for what the gospel means for each of us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. The church, particularly here in America, we're wrestling with this a little bit. You know, for 40 years, mostly evangelicals have been very unified politically. And the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is definitely dividing that and showing some crack. You're like, oh, okay, it's causing us to have to wrestle with some of these things, you know?
Yeah, and that's probably a good thing.
Absolutely,
we need to deconstruct a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think so, and then we can build back up. Wow. Yeah. Well, thanks for doing that. I appreciate. I have not read that. I think you're right. The Magnificat and all kind of the prophets. It's all over the prophets, things like that. Where I just haven't read it that way. I've read it very spiritualized. And there's something tangible when Jesus becomes, for the right now that changes how we think about him and what the good news actually is. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of natural that we do that, and I historically we've done that since Constantine came into power and became a Christian. As soon as Christians went from being a persecuted minority to being in power, we had to tone down and water down the words of Jesus by spiritualizing them. And that's why it's so dangerous in America that Christians seek so much political power, because then we become part of the status quo and we're defending our patch rather than becoming part of the subversive resistance of building a new society inside the shell of the old. That Jesus calls us to be.
Right. Yeah. I have a friend who talks about crucifying our politics to pledge allegiance to the Lamb. And I love that. He's really challenged me to start thinking about, you know what, we can't be loyal to both. It's just not a thing. So
cannot.
Oh, okay. I could go on that conversation forever, but I want to hear more about you. So I don't remember how we got off on the Magnificat either, but you were sharing the gospel with your friend, And you had gone to Cambodia. This was a missions trip, I guess.
I went for 6 months.
Okay,
at that time.
Were you just checking it out, or what were you?
Yeah, it was just one of those classic short-term mission trips, and took some time out from university and went over there for 6 months. But while I was here during that time, I really sensed God saying, "Come back long-term, live in the slums, live amongst the poor, and grapple with what it means to bring good news to the poor."
Yeah. Why does that resonate with your heart? Like, why did that at that time just call you from your affluence into the slum?
There was just a lot. I think when you come face to face with real poverty and suffering, it rocks your world, and you just can't. If you're at least open a little bit to what God might be saying, then it's gonna mess you up. And I remember going into the Genocide Museum here in Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge, wiped out a couple of million people. It was awful. Out the front of this Genocide Museum is a beggar standing. He's got one leg. He's on a crutch, and he's wearing a T-shirt. And I remember it still to this day. His T-shirt has the letters WWJD. What would Jesus do?
Oh yeah.
And I doubt he had a clue what his T-shirt meant, but it kind of struck me. And I thought, I can't just be going around Cambodia and looking into the eyes of people who are really, they've been through a lot. How can I go back and follow Jesus in the same way? I need to come here and be amongst them and learn what it means to follow Jesus.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's so interesting because, again, that's an example where we hyper spiritualize things, right? And we, for a while here, that was one of those big things, right? What WWJD? Yeah. Everybody had the bracelet, and it means something different when you're faced with a person like that.
Yeah.
How would Jesus speak to them? It's so interesting, man. I've been reading. I think I told you this. I've been reading Mark, and Jesus he's so interesting in Mark. He's just he comes across people like that, right? And he just
listen, if you want a good commentary on Mark with a perspective like this, Ched Meyer's Binding the Strong Man. It's pretty radical, but there's some pretty interesting takes on Mark in there. He draws, he helps you to see some of the political and economic aspects of Mark.
Yeah, interesting. I will definitely check that out. That sounds good. Okay, so this challenged you to think about, all right, I need to be here. So you eventually moved to Cambodia. Tell us about tell us about that.
Yeah, so I really had a strong sense that I needed to move into a slum community and live amongst the poor, and just one of the ways that we phrase it is tie my well-being to the well-being of the poor, in the sense of what happens to them, the trash, the electricity cuts happens to me. So I have some sense of what that means. It took me a while to get back, because when I went back to New Zealand to kind of prepare myself, I met a Cambodian refugee who became my wife, and she had a sense of calling back to Cambodia as well. And so it took us 2 or 3 years to kind of get prepared and move back. In the meantime, this is a weird tangent, but I graduated in business and marketing and went into the technology sector during the .com boom of the late 90s. And I was working for a software company that was making millions of dollars.
Oh, wow.
They were sending me around the world to stay in 5-star hotels and organize conferences.
Oh, wow.
And part of my job was to eat in the nicest restaurants around the hotel, just to see where the CEO clients of ours would be eating and partying. So this was kind of one of these things where, I knew I was called to the slums, and here I am doing it couldn't be more extreme opposite. Oh man, I mean, it was a time of grappling. It was hard. It was hard, but I learned some good things. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur at heart as well. God's kind of wired me that way, and I learned some good things around, you know, marketing and entrepreneurship and business that you might think, to go and be a missionary or work amongst the poor, you need to be a social worker or a doctor. Well, it's quite amazing, and I think kind of cool that God uses everyone and all the
Mm.
gifts that we have and the passions that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really cool. The juxtaposition of the people, and I would think that would say to you, okay, there are people who live like this, right? And
Mm.
and they need Jesus, but I wondered if it kind of cemented your calling to Cambodia or to the slums.
Yeah, Jackie Pullinger says, if you want to witness to the rich, minister to the poor. And I would
Hmm.
say that in ministering to the poor and living amongst the poor, I've had probably more significant opportunities to minister to people who are wealthy than I might have if I was kind of hobnobbing with them living the same lifestyle. I think that very often our following of Jesus doesn't look too different to anybody else, and so they don't perceive that we have anything interesting to offer. But I find that affluent people kind of seek me out because
Hmm.
what we're doing is so different and so countercultural. And so I think in the long run we've actually impacted folks who are from both ends of the spectrum.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's awesome. I want to ask you, have you had any times when you felt like God was far away or distant, or when you really, I know you wrestle with God, but when you really just felt like you were not even sure he was either for you or with you, or like a dark night of the soul, if you
Yeah,
will?
yeah. Um, yeah, unfortunately, I've had a couple. I
That's
wish I had only
common.
had one. Um, about and it's actually really physical and tangible. About 7 years ago, I was in the London Underground train, and I was about a mile underground, and the train broke down. And so I was stuck underground. The tunnel was about an inch from the glass of the window. And I actually experienced a bit of a panic attack. Everyone else just sitting there reading their newspapers, and I started to freak out. And that was kind of the first moment of a very dark journey into claustrophobia, where I wasn't able to get on a plane for a year. I was even having trouble getting into cars, certainly not elevators, those kind of things.
Wow.
And I actually experienced, um, for me, some of the passages in the Bible that I was really resonating was Jesus in the cave after being crucified, before being resurrected. And we skip over that part. We skip to the resurrection, but there was
Wow.
3 days in a cave,
Right.
and I feel like I've known those 3 days, and it took me a lot of work to get back on a plane, and it even today, and I have to fly every month for we work in 16 countries. It's a difficult thing for me to get on a plane, and I experience God's grace and strength in the midst of that weakness.
Hmm.
And one of the ways that I do that is I tell myself, "Come on, this suffering that you go through every time you step on board a plane, um, yeah, it's real suffering, but it's not, compared to the children that we are trying to reach, the children that we want to have an alongside, or many of them experience great suffering and abuse. And so this is a sacrifice that I can make towards seeing their suffering being relieved in some small way. So that's been a pretty dark night of the soul. And then the other one was going through pretty serious cancer as well, facing death about 6 years ago. And so I guess I've known what it means to be physically and emotionally weak. And I don't know if you can tell. I mean, I'm a fairly confident person,
Yeah.
affluent background, privileged, and I haven't experienced a lot of weakness in my life. And to come face to face with no, I am weak and I'm broken, is something that God uses and calls a lot of us to go through.
Oh, that's interesting. So you feel like God took, or you related, there's a way that you can relate to the people you're serving better because you have this weakness. You feel like
Yeah, I think
God's
so. I
pointing that
think
out?
God, um, God weakened me. But I mean, I don't think God created the claustrophobia or the cancer, but God was able to use that
Sure.
in
Yeah,
my
yeah.
life um, to bring me into a new place of humility and brokenness.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. I think it's so fascinating how he does that. How those things that we would avoid at all costs almost, right? He ends
Yeah,
up turning into things that make us stronger, or not even just stronger, but just more dependent and aware of him.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, otherwise we kind of ride high on our own successes. Some of us do. We have
Right.
the tendency to ride high on those.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, hey, let's talk a little bit about your books, because I know that the Urban Halo, which I've not had a chance to read, you're giving away this month for free on your website. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, CraigGreenfield.com. Go and grab that over there.
Yeah, and I'll have a link to that, friends, on halfwaytherepodcast.com in the show notes. So you can just grab it. Looks like if you just put in your information, you can get that book, which is great. Tell us what was that? That's a story. Is that your story?
Yeah, so that's our story of our first 7 years living in Cambodian slums, and grappling with how do we kind of the side story is how do we deal with children who are being orphaned, and
Mm,
reality around the world, and we see, this has been in the news lately with children being separated from their families on the U.S. border, and how do you care for children? And then I got into doing a little bit of research around that. I ended up doing my postgraduate research into the impact of orphanages on children who are orphaned, and realized, oh wow, there's a reason why we don't allow orphanages anymore in Western countries.
wow.
Institutionalization of children is not a good thing, and so part of the side story of that book is how we developed more of a community-based approach for caring for children, which is basically, these kids have lost their parents. Let's not take them away from everyone else that they know and love as well.
Yeah.
So there's a critique of the orphanage model in there, but also just kind of the story of what it looked like for these people to move into a slum and struggle along.
Yeah.
Mm.
So you talk about your stories of your time. So you eventually went to Vancouver and lived in the what do
Mhm.
they call it? East Side, downtown East Side.
Downtown East
I
Side.
couldn't
Yeah,
remember the order there.
yeah.
And the books of verse of Jesus is about those experiences there and what you took away from that.
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that we tend to do is romanticize the poor who are distant to us and demonize the poor who are on our own doorstep.
Oh yeah.
And it's a way of engaging with the poor at arm's length rather than in any kind of meaningful way. Because when they're distant, we can go and do a short-term trip. We can bless them, give them a few sandwiches, come back, live our lives. When they're on our doorstep, we know that engaging with them could potentially mean some kind of long-term relationship. And so we kind of do these
Right.
mental gymnastics to allow us to disengage from those around us. And so we felt, moving from Phnom Penh, one of the poorest cities in the world, to Vancouver, one of the, most beautiful and richest cities in the world, what would it look like to love the poor and move alongside and amongst those who are struggling in that kind of context? And perhaps that might even be more prophetic for the Western church in that context. So we moved into a place called the downtown East Side. A lot of people outside Canada don't know it exists, but it's actually the most concentrated area of drug activity in North America. A few blocks of just absolute brokenness and dysfunction. And we created, we kind of set up a little Christian community there where we would welcome in those who are not always welcome in our society. Radical hospitality, not Martha Stewart kind of hospitality, but welcoming in the people who are not always at our dinner table, the ones that Jesus said to welcome.
Right. So what I find fascinating, my family and I took a trip out to Washington, D.C. this past June. And when we were leaving, we're on our way to Union Station. We're walking because we weren't that far. So we're pulling our, we look like tourists. We're pulling our suitcases and everything. And we come to this corner and there's about, I don't know, I guess five people or so. And I noticed, I don't think my kids noticed this, but I noticed a drug deal basically was going down, was happening on this corner. This is what is going on.
Yeah.
And so I'm there with my little kids. I'm going, all right. It was very uncomfortable. When you lived in Vancouver, I'm reading these stories, like you had drug dealers on your doorstep.
Yeah.
Like they were just right there.
We would come home to people unconscious on our doorstep. But that's life. I mean, there was one of the interesting things that we found is there was a great deal of respect for vulnerability in the downtown East Side, and every person in the downtown East Side knew that kids were off limits, and so we would walk down the street. One kid on each hand. I have two kids, and on every block, someone would yell out, "Kids on the block," and people would just put their drugs behind their backs. They'd stop the drug deal. They'd stop fighting. I remember one time we were coming along. There was a fight going on, and they didn't notice, but halfway through, as we were approaching, someone yelled out, "Hey, shut the F up, man. Can't you see there's kids on the block?" And so they had just this respect for vulnerability. And that to me, the police couldn't shut that kind of thing down. The police were powerless.
Wow.
And that's the upside down kingdom right there, where the very people that are the weakest, the most vulnerable, and this is what the Alongsiders movement is all about, the very people that we write off and think of as victims or kids or whatever, they're the very ones who bring the kingdom of God into our midst in small subversive ways.
Right. Well, you guys did that by celebrating and having parties on the block, which I thought was a really fascinating idea.
On welfare day, when everyone gets their money, and a lot of folks were trying to stay clean on that day, but the drug dealers were really, that was a big target day. We would hold block parties and just invite lots of people. We'd have music and face painting and water balloons, and just provide some kind of safe space where you weren't kind of being targeted for drug deals. So it's that upside down kingdom of celebration and joy. Right.
Well, what I loved about that is instead of condemning, instead of hollering, instead of, telling them that they're so bad, you just created a space where that wasn't natural for them to be. Right. And you created a place that was upbeat and uplifting and celebratory. And so you really brought the kingdom to bear on the block, which I thought was just a really great example of how this actually works.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people have enough condemnation in life. What we need is more love, more joy, more welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, so how did you end up back in Cambodia after that? And I don't know how long you were in Vancouver.
We were there for 7 years, and we kind of thought that's where we would be. We don't move anywhere thinking we'll only be there for a few years. But I was diagnosed with cancer, and I I was turning 40 as well. And those two things kind of make you reevaluate your life.
Yeah.
They make you kind of think about what you're doing. And one of the questions that I began grappling with, I think it was a God question, was if I only had 5 more years to walk this earth, what would I do with those 5 years? And it's not that I wasn't doing good things. I think it was hard. The downtown east side, don't get me wrong, it was hard.
I bet.
But we were doing good things. We were serving the Lord. But God used that time of darkness and just reevaluating my life to just do a big picture evaluation. And I look back on some of the things that I'd been involved in, and we had started an Alongsiders movement in Cambodia. Alongsiders was growing like wildfire, really, throughout Cambodia. It was bearing a lot of fruit, and particularly in the lives of vulnerable children. And as I kind of asked myself, and I looked at what we were doing with people struggling with addiction and homelessness and prostitution in the downtown east side, and I knew, and they knew, a lot of that comes from stuff that's happened in childhood. And as I would talk to them about what was going on with Alongsiders in Cambodia, like my friends who are in addiction, they would say, man, if I had an Alongsider when I was a kid, maybe I wouldn't have ended up where I am now.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how much it resonated with my downtown east side friends. Anyway, I just sensed during this time, this Alongsiders movement is something not just for Cambodia. This actually would be worth kind of seeing if it could fly in other countries. And so we didn't know if it could. We felt nudged by God in that direction, but we thought, if we're wrong, I mean, holy smokes, it's worth being wrong on something like this. To go and
Right.
give everything to try and reach the most vulnerable children in the world. I mean, I can't think of a better way to spend my last 5 years on earth than giving a good kick at the bucket of something like this. And so we just went all in, ended up moving back to Cambodia and launching Alongsiders International, which has just spread into 16 countries and is just going crazy.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, that's good. I'm curious. You mentioned your wife, or that you moved there. Like what is this like as a married person? When we talk about you, and you're clearly very driven. You've got a lot of a lot of passion for this. And your wife grew up, I guess, in that context. But it takes a special person to go along with some of these things and live in some of these places that you've been.
Yeah, it does. It takes let's be honest, it takes a special person to put up with me. I have to say, it's one thing for someone from a privileged background to take on poverty. It's another thing for someone who has known poverty to knowingly return to that kind of context. And so her journey is very different from mine. We couldn't be more different personality-wise. She's much more cautious. Even moving back to Cambodia the second time, I felt like we should do it months before she did.
Wow.
And I take comfort in the Mary and Joseph story of Mary gets this word that she's going to give birth and all of this, and Joseph doesn't know that for months. He gets word much later. And
right.
So I kind of take comfort. Sometimes God does things with timing that we struggle with. But it's been a part of me learning to be a good husband, learning to love my wife and to serve the poor in ways that are safe and comfortable for her as well. And she's been on a journey as well in the opposite direction. So it's been interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah. That was one thing I kept thinking about as I was reading these stories. And you talk about it a little bit, but that is like, there's it would just be hard. It's one thing to be on board, but it's another thing to welcome people into your home. That's your home. And so I can see where that could be challenging. You have to be on the same page on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And in Subversive Jesus, I talk quite a bit about that, of how we worked through and negotiated some of that stuff, and came to be on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah, which is, I think, pretty cool as well. Wow. Well, Craig, I think I could talk to you forever, and I would really love to talk to you more. But I don't know, like I don't know where else to go with that. What else do you feel like God is doing in your, in your life, in your ministry, that you're kind of excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think just one of the things I really encourage folks to do who are kind of in North America, in that bubble, is to just um, get out of the bubble. Just
Yeah.
do what it takes to get out of your comfort zone and experience and meet other folks. You don't have to go to serve somewhere for 2 weeks. Just go and learn and listen,
Mm.
and go with a humble posture, and just experience maybe what God is doing in other parts of the world, because He is stirring things up all around the world in amazing ways. And we're encouraged to be a part of that. I feel like the image that I've been getting from God for the last 5 years or so is like there's a wave, and
Mm.
there's a massive wave, and we as the church can either be standing on the beach watching the wave go by, or not even noticing it go by. We can be being drowned by the wave, or we can be up there on top of the wave, just
Yeah.
flailing around, trying to be part of what God's doing. And I know where I want to be, and I encourage other folks to get up there.
Yeah. All right. So grab your surfboard and let's go ride the wave that God is sending our way around the world.
Right on.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Friends, you can find Craig Greenfield at craiggreenfield.com. Just click on books and you can get The Urban Halo for free. It's right there. And also, I wholeheartedly recommend Subversive Jesus. All those links are in the show notes at halfwaytherepodcast.com as well, just to make it easy on you guys. So definitely get out and do something. Get out of your comfort zone. Get out of the bubble. I know that's something that both my wife and I feel God is calling us to do. And so I think we're going to take you up on that advice, Craig.
Right on, man.
Thanks for being
here.
here.
Come visit us in Cambodia sometime.
We should do that. That would be fun. All right. Thanks a lot.
Right on.
Friends, I just want to give you one more encouragement to reach out. You can hit me up on Facebook or Twitter, or like Sean, he hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm in all those places, or you can just go to halfwaytherepodcast.com/contact. I want to talk with you, so reach out. Until next time, keep the faith.